Hello everybody, welcome back to Screenstars and welcome to something a little bit different on the channel. I haven't done one of these for a while and it is a tag video. Now these were all the rage a couple of years ago. There were loads of tag videos going around on YouTube and there doesn't seem to be as many these days. However, I saw this tag video over on Lisa Love's channel. If you haven't checked Lisa's channel out, please head over there and subscribe. It's a really cool channel. And she has done a tag video. Well, she didn't originate the tag video. It came from David's Horror, I believe. So make sure you head over to David's Horror as well and subscribe if you're not a subscriber. And it is the Horror Tag 2022. And there are 10 questions that I have to answer. I will say off the bat, if anybody wants to partake in this tag video, please feel free to do so. If you've got your own YouTube channel, please make a video. If you don't have a YouTube channel and you want to take part, just fire your answers into the comments. I would be interested to read and see what you guys, what your answers would be to these questions. So let's get on with it then. So the first question is, what is my earliest memories of horror? I would say probably my earliest memories of horror are initially things like in the UK there was a show called Tales of the Unexpected. It was kind of like a bit of the UK's version of the Outer Limits sort of thing, or the Twilight Zone, a little bit like that, with a bit of Hammer horror thrown in for good measure. And I remember watching it, and some of the stories were quite frightening to me as a child. And then, of course, the classic Doctor Who hiding behind the sofa or hiding behind the cushions when I was a kid. Some of the monsters from Doctor Who certainly scared me when I was younger. And then when I got a little bit older, I was introduced to horror by how most teenagers are are introduced to horror, by kind of sneaking and watching things that you shouldn't. And for me, with my brother and sister, we used to kind of sneak off and watch things like Alien, American Werewolf in London, and The Thing are the ones that really stick in my mind when I was young. When we got our first VHS player, my dad used to kind of rent them and bring them back, and I remember watching things like that. I remember Alien having a big impact on me. I wouldn't eat eggs for a long time after watching Alien, and I've talked about these stuff before. American Werewolf in London had a profound effect on me because at the opening of that, when they're on the moors, I grew up at a place called Heptonstall in Yorkshire in the UK, and it was all moorlands up there. So it felt like it was literally outside my door. The opening of that film really scared me, and The Thing I thought was really scary as well. So those are my earliest memories of horror. But also, as well, as something I want to mention, there's a film called Rawhead Rex that me and my brother kind of sneaked and watched. I think it was either Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve when we were younger. And I remember not that one particularly scaring me, but I remember watching it with the lights off, watching it with my brother and really enjoying that as well. So yeah, those are kind of my earliest memories of horror. Right, what is my favourite horror? That's a difficult one to answer in a sense of just giving you one horror, because there's so many great horrors out there. But I would probably say The Thing is right up there. Well, the three I mentioned earlier, like The Thing, American Werewolf in London, and Alien, and things like that, are just fantastic horrors. I would say Halloween. Whereas I didn't like that so much when I was younger. That's one of the horrors that I've really learnt to respect and appreciate as I've got older. I realised just how good it is. And my favourite modern day horror, I would probably say, is The Conjuring. And I explained that in a recent review that I did for The Conjuring. I just think it's the perfect modern horror. It's really accessible to like anybody, really, that film, and it is still genuinely scary. So I'd say The Conjuring is probably right up there with some of the best horrors I've seen in the last decade or so. Right, what is my favourite horror science fiction? Well, again, I'm repeating myself, but The Thing, that's a sci-fi, really. Even though it's based on Earth, there's definitely a sci-fi element to that film. So I would say certainly that, but I also think it's really hard to look past the obvious one, which is Alien. It's one that many people will say, but it is a true horror. A lot of times sci-fi mixes with other genres when it does horror. So you've got sci-fi action with aliens and Predator and things like that. You can also class them as horrors. So, but I think Alien is pure horror, regardless of the setting. You know what I mean? It's just kind of set on a spaceship with this alien. And I just think it is just a masterpiece. So those two, I would say. What is my favourite horror subgenre? Well, anybody that knows me already knows the answer to this question, and it has to be found footage. I really like found footage, very much like you, Lisa. You know how much of a fan I am of found footage. I've dedicated 2 top 10 lists to found footage films. I've got my own found footage playlist on the channel, and I'm always seeking out new and interesting found footage films to watch. So, yeah, I would say found footage is definitely my favourite horror subgenre. What would I say is the goriest horror? That's not actually easy. Goriest. I'm not a big fan of gore for gore's sake in horror films. So if they try and, put gore in just to kind of make it look disgusting, I'm not really that interested in that sort of thing. So I think some of the goriest things I've seen are I think the Evil Dead remake was pretty gory, from what I remember. I thought that was quite effective. And of course, and again, I'm repeating myself, The Thing. Why would I not say The Thing? I remember that absolutely shocking me, the gore in that when I first watched it. And it is still effective today. The effects still stand up today. The next question is, what would I say is an underrated horror? This one, I did put a little bit of thought into this one. And I've got 2 really that I could probably list off a good 10 or 15 films here. Films certainly that I've reviewed on the channel as well, because I reviewed a lot of horror. But I would say 2 that I would suggest you watch if you haven't seen and don't necessarily get the respect that they deserve is a film called Frailty, directed by Bill Paxton and starring Bill Paxton, which I think is really fantastic. It's a horror, but it's also crossed with a thriller, but it's just brilliantly made. And I also think there's a film called The Void that came out 2018, was it? I might be wrong on that. But it's very, very John Carpenter-ish. It's like a Lovecraftian. It's like if H.P. Lovecraft and John Carpenter collaborated on a film. That's what would come out, The Void. I just think it's really, really good. And if you like John Carpenter films, I think you would like The Void. So what is my favourite horror anthology? Well, I actually quite like horror anthology films as well. I think they can be easy to watch. I don't necessarily mind if they're all as strong as each other. I think, you've got your classic creep shows. I like both Creepshow 1, Creepshow 2. But I think probably my favourite anthology franchise is the VHS franchise because they're found footage, and I like found footage. So found footage and horror anthology for me is perfect almost, you know what I mean? And I think the best VHS film is VHS 2, another film I've recently covered on the channel. So that's my favourite horror anthology film, VHS 2. Another difficult question is, what is my favourite Stephen King adaptation? Well, he's one of the most adapted authors on the planet, really. I mean, so many of his books have been turned into films, some of them massively successful, and they've really been adapted really well, and some of them not so much. For me, I think it's hard not to put The Shawshank Redemption at the top. But many people don't associate that with Stephen King, but it really is Stephen King that did that. I think it's my favourite film of all time, really. So I'd probably Shawshank Redemption, but there's so many great ones. I would also say The Green Mile is superb, and I really enjoyed the recent It films, especially the first one. I thought they were really, really good and fine adaptations of the Stephen King works. And my favourite horror from the last 10 years. Well, I've already kind of covered that earlier. I would probably say The Conjuring. I did mention it earlier that I thought it was one of the strongest films of the last decade. I'm a fan of the Conjuring universe, even though it just sounds stupid when you say Conjuring universe. But I do think there are quite a few very good films in that series of films, and I think Conjuring is still the strongest. So I would say The Conjuring. And the favourite horror icon. There's so many horror icons out there, but for me, I would probably have to say Michael Myers. It's the Halloween franchise is probably my favourite horror franchise. It's a franchise that I've grown, like I've said earlier, to appreciate more as I've got older. I wasn't that interested in slasher films when I was younger, and certainly the Halloween films pretty much when I was younger. But I've learned to appreciate them more as I've got older. There's some real stinkers, obviously, in the franchise, but I think Michael Myers, for me, is the most iconic, and he was amongst the first. You know, most of the horror icons that you can come up with came after Michael Myers, so he was kind of the blueprint almost, and he's still massively effective today. Regardless of what you think of the recent 3 Halloween films, I really enjoyed all of them to a larger degree. It was fantastic to see him back on screen. And it was just a real joy to have such a horror icon back on the big screen. So that is it. That's the 10 questions, guys. I hope you enjoyed listening to my answers. As I mentioned earlier, please let me know in the comments if you want to take part in the tag. Let me know what your thoughts are. And of course, guys, thank you very much for watching. I will be back with loads more content and reviews and everything else on the channel very soon.